Whenever we are sending a erroneous parameter, some exceptional error or local or logical error is taking place, then we will end it up with this system errors. Whether it is aborted state or a committed state, once we are done with the transaction, then we have to be terminated from the transaction. That means we should come out of the transaction if we have an insufficient balance and if we are giving a wrong pin. So for that reason, the transaction has to be cancelled necessarily. Then we call that kind of transaction failure as a local errors. Hello everybody, a warm welcome to one and all. Welcome back to the last session of chapter 2 in the unit 3 of third semester B.Ca subject called Database Management Systems. In short, it is Dbms. I am Rohini TS, Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. As you all know that in the last session of this chapter, we had a discussion regarding what do you mean by transaction, what is transaction processing system. In that, we got to know what is transaction processing system, why it is required, that and all we had a discussion. And also we got to know what you mean by the single and multi-user system, why it is needed and how many number of users will be there. And I have discussed regarding what is this read and write operations, and also we had a discussion regarding this need of concurrency control. What do you mean by concurrent execution, why it is needed, and also we had a discussion with WW or write-write conflicts. Along with that, we had a discussion regarding dirty read problems. That is what we had a discussion in our last session. So in our today's session, we're going to learn about the types of failure. So what do you mean by failure and what are its different types? Why it will going to occur in the transaction? And also I will be discussing what are the different states we have in a transaction or a transaction states. At last, we're going to understand what is this asset properties. This is what desirable properties of a transaction that we considered as an asset. There is a meaning for each of the character here. That is what I will be discussing at the end of this today's session. Let me get into it. First, we'll understand what you mean by failure and what different kind of failure we have. So, when something went wrong with the media or with the transaction or with the system, then we call that as a failure. There will be n number of reasons in order to have this failures. So that is what the different types of failures that we have here. So failures are generally classified as transaction failures, system failures and media failures. So there is a several possibility of having this transaction fail in between the execution of a transaction. So here we have a list of failures. In that, first we have a computer failure or a system crash. If something went wrong with the hardware, software or any of the network error which occurs in the computer during the time of transaction or at the middle of a transaction, then we call that kind of failure as what? Computer failure or a system crash. So something wrong with this hardware or software or any of the network issues may occur at the during or at the time of transaction execution. So hardware crashes are usually media failures. For example, main memory failures. If something went wrong with the memory or with a hard disk, then we consider that kind of failures as was system crash. Sometime your mobile just going to get shut it down immediately. That is what taking place without your knowledge. So there will be some errors with respect to the memory. So that is what we call that as a system crash, like that. That comes under first one, computer failure or a system crash. What is the second one? A transaction or system errors. So whenever we are performing the operation in the transaction, it will going to may fail. Why? Because integer overflow. That means there is a mobile number field. So for that mobile number, you are just going to give more than 12 numbers. So I am taking country code and plus 10 digits of mobile. But if you are entering more than that value, that is what? Overflow here, integer overflow or division by 0. If you are trying to divide any of the number by 0, if something taking place exceptionally, then we call that kind of failures as what? Transaction or a system error. The transaction failure may also occur because of the erroneous parameter. The mobile number field, you have to feed numbers. Instead of that, if you are giving the characters or a varchar content to that integer field, then we are going to have this system error. That means what? We are sending the erroneous parameter or a values because of a logical programming error. The user have to interrupt the transaction during its execution. The user will going to get interrupted by the execution of a transaction. Due to all these reasons, we are going to end up with this system error or a transaction error. Whenever we are sending a erroneous parameter, some exceptional error or local or logical error is taking place, then we will end up with this system errors. What is the next type? So we have a local errors or exception condition detected by the transaction. You are trying to withdraw money, but if you have an insufficient balance, then that is what this local errors or exceptional conditional transaction. So during the transaction execution, certain condition may occur that necessitate cancellation of the transaction. So, if any transaction is taking place at the time, intentionally or by necessity, we have to cancel the transaction. So, when that kind of failure is taking place, then we call that as a local errors or exceptional, which is going to be detected by the transaction. So, if you are giving a more amount to be withdrawn, if you have an insufficient balance, and if you are giving a wrong pin, so for that reason, the transaction has to be cancelled necessarily. Then we call that kind of transaction failure as a local errors or exceptional conditions. What is the next failure? We have concurrency control enforcement. Whenever we are having this concurrency control, more than one transaction is taking place in a same database, will going to be accessed by n number of users at the same time. So at this time, we have to do this abort of the transaction has to take place. Why? Because we have to restart it later for certain reasons. So whenever they are violating the serializability, if it is not taking place one by one, if all are getting rushed together, or because several transactions are in the state of deadlock. So if your mobile is in the stuck stage, what you are going to do? You are just going to restart it. No, that is what will going to take place in the concurrency control enforcement. So if the serializability is not maintained properly, and then state of transaction in the deadlock, that means if it is keep on buffering, if it is keep on waiting for the resources which is used by some other transaction, that means what? You are keep on waiting for the resource. Next state of a transaction is not taking place there, then we call that state as a deadlock here. That is what the reason we are going to end up with this concurrency control enforcement error. After this, we have a disk failures. This is a common failures. So some disk blocks may be lose their data because of the read and write malfunction. So already you know what are the different read and write conflicts we have. We have a lost update problem, and also we have a read write conflicts or dirty read conflicts, or because of a disk read write head crash. So if something went wrong with a read write head, so also at the time we are going to end up with this failures. This may happen during the read or writing of the operation during the transaction. If something went wrong with the head crash, at the time we are ended up with this disk failure, or some memory space is not there in the disk. If it is not fetching the content properly, if it is not writing the content properly, then we are founded with this disk failures. Next, we have a physical problem and catastrophes here. That will going to refers or any physical damages or mistakes or any error areas taking place with respect to the physical component. At the time also we are ended up with some problem. For example, air conditioning problem, if SMPS is not working properly, and fire, theft, and overwriting of the disk, and tapes by mistake, and mounting of a wrong tape by the operator. So all these are what? Physical errors or physical problems or catastrophes. All these are normalized, or normally we are getting all these problems during the transaction. These are the different types of transaction which we can find in the time of execution of a transaction. let me move to the next concept that is very, very important, that is states of transaction or transaction state. Already you know, transaction is the logical unit which we are having in a database. That means several action is taking place. Then what are the different types of transaction state we have? So here we have a active state, partially committed state, failed state, aborted state, committed state, and also we have a terminated state. So by just looking into this diagram, you won't be able to understand what these different states are, how it is taking place. Already you know, we have a read and write operation. So active state is the state where the execution being started. That means we are activating the transaction. So that may include read or write operation. So whenever it is active, that can become failure state. That means if it is not taking place properly, then we will end up with failed state. After that, there is another possibility. If it is in the active state, if everything is going well, then it will be partially committed state. That means it is at the end of a transaction, but I don't know whether it is going to be successful or a failed one. Then we call that as a partially committed state. So if it is permanent stores or it is going to be successful, then it will going to reach to the committed state. That means the transaction will going to be takes place completely or entirely without any mistake. Then we call that as a committed state. If something went wrong with this end of a transaction, again it will reach to the failed state. So whenever I am coming back from that failed state, then it may reach to the aborted state. So when the content or when the transaction is in aborted state, then it can be rolled back. But when it reaches to the failed state, somehow we can't recover it back. So when it reaches to the committed state, whether it is aborted state or a committed state, once we are done with the transaction, then we have to be terminated from the transaction. That means we should come out of the transaction. Then we call that as a terminated state. So these are the different state which we have in the transaction. You understand? Active state is the state where we are starting or the execution of a transaction is taking place. So it can be read or write operation. So there is a chances of partially committing that read and write operation, or it may reach to the failure state. So if it can be recovered from the failed state, then it will going to reach to the aborted state. So that is different than the aborted state, that you have to understand here. So if it is partially committed, if everything went well, then it will going to store the content or updated content of a transaction in the database permanently. After that, it will going to reach to the terminated state. If it is in the active state, failed, it can be rolled back, then it will reach to the aborted state. After that, termination will going to takes place. This diagram is important, notation is important, and mention what are the different activities taking place at the time of each state of a transaction. That is what state of transaction. In this, first we have an active state. It is the first state of every transaction. In this, the transaction is being executed. After that, if you take the example of insertion or deletion or any of the updation of a record, that is also going to be done in this active state. That means what? Freshly we are starting the execution of an operation, but all the records are still not saved to the database. We just started the transaction, but that not yet saved. Then when it going to be saved, that comes to the partially committed state. Here also, I am not going to save the content. So why? Because in partially committed state, the transaction executes its final operation. If you take the example, you are just going to take your mobile and you are going to open any of the app for the online transaction. So at the time, you are giving all the amount, you are mentioning all the amount and recipient, and also you are mentioning your password. So after that, whenever you are going to click send, so before that, before the send option, we call everything as a partially committed. I don't know, whenever I'm sending that amount or at that time, whether it going to be failed or it can be insufficient balance or it may not reach to the recipient. Sometimes server will be down. So that is what the reason it is in the partially committed state. So, but the data is still not saved to the database even in the partially committed state. Then what will going to happen in the committed state? You have sent a money from your account to some recipient account. You are clicking the send option. If it is reaching them with a proper transaction, then we call that as a successful transaction. That comes under this committed state. A transaction is said to be in committed state if it executes all its operation successfully. Then that is what committed state here. So after this, all the effects are now permanently saved on the database system. Whenever we reach to this committed state, whatever the transaction has been takes place up to that time, everything will going to be saved permanently in the database. Then after the active state, if it is reaching to the failed state, or at the time of partially committed state, though it is reaching to the failed state, if any of the checks made by the database recovery system fails, then the transaction is said to be in the failed state. So this is somehow dead kind of thing here. So that is what failed state. So if you have a insufficient balance, or if server is down, then again you have to restart the system. You can't go back to the previous state. That is what failed state. If you are able to go back to the previous state, then we consider that as aborted state here. That means your password is wrong, and if you have given wrong recipient, so you can go back and you take it back. That is what aborted state. But when you reach to the failed state, then somehow there will be no chances of rolling back it. That is what you need to understand. If any of the checks fails and the transaction has reached a failed state, then the database recovery system will make sure that the database in its previous consistent state. Then we call that as a aborted state here. So if not, then it will be abort or roll back to the transaction to bring the database into the consistent state. So if you are giving a wrong password, amount will not going to be deducted from your account. That means what? They are maintaining the consistency in the bank balance. Though you are giving a wrong password, but it is deducting a money from your account, then it is not maintaining a consistency. So at the time, whenever you are giving a wrong password, we are at the aborted state. Then we have to go back and we have to give a proper account password. Then we can reach to the partially committed state. Then it will going to be sent to the recipient. If it is sent successfully to the recipient, then we are going to reach the commit state. That is what you need to understand. If the transaction fails in the middle of the transaction, then before executing the transaction, all the executed transactions are rolled back to its consistent state. Very, very important point for this aborted. Then after aborting the transaction, the database recovery module will going to select one of the two operations. It has to restart the transaction. Whenever you are giving a wrong password, you may start it from the first transaction itself, or else you can kill the transaction. That means you can cancel the transaction itself, or else again you need to restart the transaction. There will be two possibilities with respect to this aborted state. That is what you need to understand, whether it is failed, aborted, committed, or it has to reach to the last one, that is terminated state. That is what the different types of states or a different state of transaction which we have learned now. So we'll understand the next very important concept. You may expect this for your examination also. Desirable properties, then we call that properties as asset properties of the transaction. So whenever we are doing a transaction, that has to take place entirely, or it should not do anything. If I am sending a money to someone else from my account, the transaction has to take place completely. The amount has to be deducted from my account and should reach to the recipient account. That is what the successful transaction. If not, the amount should not be deducted from my account, and that amount should not be credited to recipient account. Then we call that as a proper transaction. So every transaction has to take place like that itself. The transaction should possess several properties here. Then we are calling that properties are asset property. That means A represents atomicity, consistency, isolation, and also we have a durability. These are the different meaning or different abbreviation of this asset properties, and they should be enforced by the concurrency control and recovery methods of the Dbms. So we have to possess this asset properties in order to have a very efficient and effective transaction. We'll understand what you mean by this atomicity here. A transaction is an atomic unit of a processing. That means what? It should be get done completely, or it should not initiate at all. Then it is either performed in its entirely or not performed at all. The amount has to be deducted, should be reached to the recipient. That is what complete transaction. Or else the amount should not be deducted, should not be credited. That is what? Another way. Then we call that as a atomicity. It has to take place entirely or should not initiate at all. Then what is the second property here? That is consistency preservation. So whenever we are doing some transaction, if something went wrong, it has to roll back to the previous consistent state. And whenever we are reaching to the next step of a transaction, there also we should maintain some consistency. That is what? Very important role. If the amount is not being deducted from your account, then it should be consistent. The account balance should be consistent. If it is deducted, then you have to get a message and that has to reach back to the consistent state itself. The transaction is consistency preserving if it is complete execution, takes the database from one consistent state to another consistent state. That is what the second important property. Next we have a isolation here. If I am sending a money, the account balance should be deducted from my account, not from somebody else's account. That is what? Isolation. So, isolation in the sense what? The transaction should not affect other transaction, or it should not get affected by any other transaction. Then we call that as a isolation. That is what the reason whenever you are booking a movie ticket, you are getting a separate seat. That means what? I am unable to access the content, or I am unable to access the seats which are already booked. That is what? Isolation. It is not affecting any other transaction, or it is not getting affected by any other transaction. That is what? Isolation here. The transaction should appear as a, though it is being executed in the isolation from other transaction. That means what? The execution of a transaction should not be influenced by any other transaction executing concurrently. It should not be interfered by any other transaction, or it should not interfere with any other transaction. That is what? Isolation. What is the last one? Durability or permanency. So if you go back to any of the online mode or online transaction mode, there you have a history. Why? Because that will going to shows what are the committed state, or what are the aborted state, or any of the failed transaction. You are just going to get every information with respect to the transaction. So we have to have a permanency in the storage of data during the transaction. The changes applied to the database by a committed transaction must persist in the database. Whatever the changes we are making, that should not get lost because of any of the failure. Though it is failed, that has to be shown as a failed transaction. That has to take place in this durability. So by all these, atomicity, consistency, isolation and durability, what we can conclude here, the atomicity will going to improve, or it requires that we execute a transaction for the purpose of completion. It has to take place entirely or should not initiate at all. That is what? Atomicity. And this preservation of consistency will going to shows the integrity of a data. That has to enforce the integrity constraint. So it should maintain very properly. Consistent state of a transaction is very important. After that, isolation will going to be enforce the data recovery and concurrency control of a DBMS. And at last we have a durability, that is the responsibility of a recovery subsystem of the DBMS to ensure and to inform all the committed or even failed state of a transaction. Everything should be preserved properly at the terms of permanency or a durability. These are the very important asset properties of a transaction. You can also expect question from this topic as well. I hope I made it clear and easy for all of you. We are done with DBMS syllabus completion. Let me meet you in the new subject with a new semester. Until that, keep learning, keep on growing. All the very best for your examination. Thank you so much.